Hi, I'm Emily. Coming back to my hometown after college should have felt comforting, but stepping into my late father's house felt more like entering a cold, unfamiliar place. My stepdad Paul, his wife Susan, and their kids Mark and Lucy had turned the house into something I barely recognized. The warmth and happiness that once filled the house were gone, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence that felt like it was choking me. "Make sure you clean up after yourself. We don't need more mess around here," Susan said sharply as I pulled my suitcase toward my old room. Lucy stared at me like I was some unwanted guest, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. "Why is she even back? Didn't she get the message to stay away?" Mark didn't even bother pretending to be nice, sneering as he walked past me. "Guess college didn't work out, huh? Came crawling back?" It hurt. These were supposed to be the people who were my family. My dad had married Susan after my mom died when I was just a child. He always hoped Susan and I would get along, and that her kids would be like siblings to me, but after he died suddenly last year, any sense of family disappeared with him. I mostly kept to myself, spending time in my room or hanging out with friends, but the more I tried to avoid problems, the more they pushed me out. They moved my things from shared spaces, threw away my food by accident, and made sure I felt like a stranger in my own home. One evening, when I came back from a walk, I overheard Paul and Susan talking in the kitchen. They didn't notice me standing just outside the doorway. "She has no clue about the will," Paul said. "As far as anyone's concerned, everything went to you and me." Susan's voice was cold and calm as she replied, "Let's keep it that way. The less she knows, the better. We can't afford any trouble." Trouble? My father's will? They were hiding something important. The truth hit me hard. Not only did they not want me here, but they were also trying to keep me from finding out something that might actually belong to me. That night, lying in my old bed, surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked, because I never felt at home, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with them. I started planning my escape. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew I had to leave. The next morning, I met my best friend Jamie at the local cafe, and we looked through rental listings. Jamie placed a comforting hand on mine and said with a smile, "You know you can always stay with me until you find a place." "Thanks," I replied. "I might just do that," I replied, trying to force a smile. It was a huge relief to know I had at least one ally in this town. The coffee shop buzzed with the lively chatter of people starting their day, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence at Paul's house. Here, I could breathe. Here, I could think. As I sipped my coffee, a plan slowly began to take shape in my mind. I needed to uncover what they were hiding about my father's will. But first, I had to secure a new place, a safe space where I could regroup and prepare for whatever was coming next. Moving into my tiny apartment felt like stepping into a completely different world, a small, cramped world, but it was mine. The freedom was thrilling, even though the financial pressure was real. I scraped by with an online business, selling handmade crafts I'd started making as a hobby. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a step towards something bigger, something that belonged to me. One chilly morning, while updating my online store, I remembered something my dad used to say: "Always carve your own path. No matter how tough it gets, keep your chin up and push forward." His words felt like a soothing balm to my tired spirit. He had always been my source of strength, teaching me how to be resilient when life threw challenges my way. With his advice echoing in my head, I knew it was time to deal with the situation at the house. I needed answers, and there was only one place I could get them. I made an appointment with my dad's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, hoping he could help me figure out what was really going on. Sitting across from him in his office, surrounded by the scent of old books and leather, I felt a mix of nervousness and hope. "I've been wondering about the house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have concerns about how things were handled after my father passed." Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and pulled a thick file from his desk drawer. "Well, Emily, according to your father's will, the house was left entirely to you." The room seemed to spin as I processed what Mr. Thompson had just told me. "The house belongs to me?" I managed to say, still in shock. "Paul may have had other ideas," Mr. Thompson replied calmly, "but your father was very clear in his intentions. Here, take a look for yourself." He handed me a copy of the will and pointed to a specific clause. My hands trembled as I read it, seeing my father's words written out, a clear confirmation of what should have been mine all along. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of emotions: anger, relief, determination, all swirling inside me like a storm. I thought about the days I'd spent with my dad in our backyard, him teaching me how to negotiate, how to stand my ground, and never let anyone push me around. You've got to stand tall, Emily, he would say, no matter what. Armed with the truth and my father's lessons, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about exposing Paul for the liar he was and for dishonoring my father's memory. That night, I began gathering everything I needed: evidence of Paul's deceit, proof of my rightful claim to the house, and a plan to confront him. I reached out to a few of my dad's old friends who might support my case, and I started documenting everything. I also called Susan, hoping to gauge whether she was aware of what Paul had been doing or if she was involved. Her guarded tone and evasive answers only made me more determined. Things aren't always what they seem, Emily, she said cautiously, with a trace of unease in her voice. No, they're not, I replied, my voice hardening, and soon, everyone will see things for what they really are. As I hung up, a mixture of nerves and resolve settled over me. This wasn't just about fighting for a house, it was about defending my father's legacy, and I was ready. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I went through boxes of my dad's old papers, finding receipts, emails, and letters that hinted at just how deep Paul's deception ran. Every piece of evidence was carefully organized and catalogued, building my case bit by bit. One evening, while sifting through a box labeled tax documents, I found a letter from a family friend, Mr. Henderson, addressed to my father. The letter detailed a conversation with Paul, where Paul had openly stated his plan to convince everyone that the house should belong to him and Susan after my father's passing. It was the smoking gun I needed. The next day, I met with Mr. Henderson, who was more than willing to provide a sworn statement recounting his conversation with Paul. Armed with this new evidence, I called my cousin Alex, who specialized in real estate law. We met at a small cafe downtown, where I laid out everything I had uncovered. Emily, you have a strong case here, Alex said, reviewing the documents. Based on this, Paul's actions could easily be considered fraud. You have rights, and we can fight to enforce them. With Alex's help, we drafted a formal letter to Paul, asserting my legal claim to the house and warning him of the consequences if he continued with his dishonest tactics. It felt incredibly empowering to finally take decisive action, knowing I was on solid ground. But the real turning point came when I decided to confront Susan directly. If she truly didn't know the full extent of Paul's schemes, she deserved to. One afternoon, I invited her to meet for coffee, hoping that in a neutral space, we could talk openly. Susan, I found something troubling in my father's documents, I began, carefully watching her reaction. There are inconsistencies in what Paul has told us about the house. According to my father's will, the house was left to me, not to Paul. I have the documents to prove it. Susan's face turned pale, her eyes flickering with a mix of surprise and confusion. I had no idea, she stammered. Paul told me the house was left to both of us, to secure our future. I understand this is hard to hear, and I'm not trying to start a conflict, I said, keeping my tone calm but firm, but you deserve to know the truth. I think Paul has misled both of us. Susan was silent for a moment, then slowly nodded. I need to think about this, Emily. If what you're saying is true, I need to reassess a lot of things. As we parted, I sensed a shift. Susan's reaction was exactly what I had hoped for, a crack in Paul's lies that could bring everything down. Walking back to my apartment, my resolve hardened. This was no longer just about reclaiming my father's house. It was about justice and making sure my father's wishes were honored, ensuring that deceit wouldn't win. The day of the confrontation felt like the climax of a storm that had been brewing for months. I had everything prepared, the evidence neatly organized in a folder, testimonies from key people, and most importantly, the support of my friends and family. I invited Paul, Susan, and their kids over under the pretense of discussing family matters. As they settled into the living room, the tension was thick. I began, "Thank you all for coming. There's something important we need to talk about regarding my father's house and his will." Paul scoffed, his arrogance clear. "Here we go again, Emily. What now? More accusations?" I didn't flinch. "Not accusations, Paul, facts." I laid out the documents on the coffee table: my father's will, the letter from Mr. Henderson, and legal assessments. According to these documents, confirmed by multiple legal advisors, this house was left to me, not to you. Paul, you've been lying to everyone. Susan's eyes darted between the papers and Paul. "Is this true? Paul, did you lie about the will?" Paul's calm exterior cracked, his voice rising in desperation. "It's not like that, Susan. I did it for us. For our future. But Susan wasn't buying Paul's excuses. Her expression hardened as she fully turned to face him, her decision clear in her eyes. Lying about this? What else have you lied about, Paul? I can't do this anymore. She stood up, taking Mark and Lucy by the hands. We're leaving. I need to think about what's best for the kids and me. As they walked out, leaving Paul to deal with the mess he'd created, I felt a wave of mixed emotions. There was a sense of vindication for myself, but also sorrow for Susan and the children. In the weeks that followed, word of Paul's deceit spread quickly throughout the community. He didn't just lose his family, his reputation, once built on the image of a respectable family man, was in ruins. Socially ostracized and isolated, he faced the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, I moved back into the house, the one that had silently witnessed so much of my life. As I unpacked, I came across a box of old letters and photos, memories of my father. Each one reminded me of his love and presence. It was in this home, filled with echoes of the past, that I truly realized what I had reclaimed. I didn't just make the house my home, I turned it into a space for community and healing. The business I'd started out of necessity grew and flourished, and I began hosting workshops to help others who were fighting their own battles against deceit and manipulation. Standing in the newly renovated living room, now alive with laughter and conversation from a local support group meeting, I felt a deep connection to my father's legacy. This house, once a place of conflict, was now a sanctuary, a place of healing and strength. This victory wasn't just about winning back a house or defeating a deceitful stepfather. It was about reclaiming my life, honoring my father's memory, and building a future on the values of integrity and resilience he had instilled in me. And that brings us to the end of the story. Now, I have a question for you. If you were in Susan's position, would you have made the same choice to leave Paul after discovering the truth? Or would you have tried to find another solution? What would you do differently, and why? I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support means a lot and helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to read your responses.